Hi, this is Grant with Pfeiffer Forensics, and today we're going to be talking about two different but very related concepts. The first is the logical structure of an argument, and the second is framework, which, if you don't know what that term is, don't worry, we'll explain it. So our goals for today are simple. First, understand the technical structure of an argument, and second, understand the function of framework in Lincoln-Douglas debate. Beginning with the structure of an argument, it's important to realize that a proper argument in debate generally has three essential components. First, an argument needs to have a claim. Second, an argument needs to have a warrant or a justification, a reason why the claim is true. And third, an argument needs to have an impact. In debate, this specifically means why the judge should vote for you if your argument is true. To see the structure in action, let's look at an example. Let's say we're talking about the resolution resolved. Just governments ought to require that employers pay a living wage. For this example, we're just going to use a very simple and short argument. Let's say that the affirmative debater claims, quote, "My first contention is that a living wage would help unskilled workers. Unskilled workers often have no choice but to work for the minimum wage, in which they experience poverty and suffering for XYZ reasons. A living wage would increase the wages that these people earn, thus making them better off and happier, which is good." Now, let's talk about the claim, warrant, and impact that's in this argument. The claim is pretty straightforward, that a living wage would help unskilled workers. The warrant is that unskilled workers often have no choice to work the minimum wage, causes suffering, and the living wage increases these wages and makes them better off and happier. And the impact here is that it's a good thing to make people much better off and happier. Now, in most arguments that you might have in some sort of a public sphere, we would probably just agree that making somebody much better off and happier is a good thing, and consequently we would consider this part of the argument to be the impact, rather than this one because we wouldn't be saying this in the first place. But this is where Lincoln-Douglas is unique with how it treats its impacts. So the argument that you just saw shows that a living wage promotes standards of living. Now, obviously, the negative debater isn't just going to accept their opponent's arguments and say, yeah, I think a living wage is good. Instead, they're going to reply. Now, there's two general ways that the negative debater can reply to that argument. The first is that the negative debater could argue that a living wage won't promote standards of living, or happiness, whatever. For one example, they might say, oh, a living wage will actually cause unemployment, which is really bad because it's better to have a bad job than no job, so it's actually going to hurt standards of living. The second way that the negative debater might respond is by saying, oh, promoting standards of living isn't the most important thing. For example, we should be looking to free trade because it's really important to respect everybody's freedom. So what we can see is that the first response that the negative gives, it replies to the warrant in the affirmative's argument. And it says, hey, actually, you're wrong about your warrant, it goes the other way. But the second type of argument is about what's special in Lincoln-Douglas debate. We compare impacts using what's called framework. Now, if you've never heard the term framework before, or you don't really understand it, we can define it this way. Framework refers collectively to those arguments that determine how the debate should be judged. One phrase that's often used to encompass this idea is that framework is the lens through which you view the round. Now, what that means in simple language is just framework is an argument that tells the judge how they should evaluate other arguments. The reason that it's necessary is framework lets us compare impacts. Let's say that the affirmative debater won their argument that, yeah, a living wage is going to promote standards of living, and that's really good. Let's say also, though, that the negative made an argument that the living wage is going to restrict freedom of trade, and freedom of trade is really important. Now, if we don't have a framework debate, it's going to be really hard for the judge to evaluate which of those comes first. So that's why we have this debate. And the extent to which we have this debate is relatively unique to Lincoln-Douglas. As in most other events, you might just make a few common sense arguments, whereas these arguments can often be the focus of a round in LD. So just some types of framework arguments that you might have heard are the value and value criterion, which I'll explain that in a little bit if you've never heard it. Additionally, although a lot of people don't think of them this way, framework arguments also include definition arguments as well as arguments about burdens, which burdens are things that a debater has to do if they want to win the round. An example of a burden would be the affirmative has to defend the resolution as a general principle. The reason that I consider these framework arguments is that they tell the judge, hey, if my opponent isn't defending this type of argument, then they're not defending their side of the resolution and you shouldn't vote for them. It's just like a value criterion, but rather it frames the entire debate versus specifically the contention level of the debate. And I've got more on definitions and burdens on my video on burdens and abusive arguments, so feel free to check that out if you want to learn more about that. Next, we're going to talk about the most common type of framework debate, and that is that which occurs in the value and value criterion debate. In order to understand what a value is, I like to look to one paragraph that's written by Lewis Vaughan in his textbook, Doing Ethics. Now, he's not specifically talking about debate, but he explains it in a way that makes a lot of sense. He explains that ethics is concerned with values, specifically moral values. Through the sifting and weighing of moral values, we determine what the most important things are in our lives. We decide what is the greatest good, what goals we should pursue in life, and what virtues we should cultivate, what duties we should or should not fulfill, and what pains and perils we should be willing to endure for the notions such as the common good, justice, and rights. So basically, a value is what you argue and declare to be the most important consideration for whether we should affirm or negate the resolution. To understand this idea a little bit better, we'll do an activity where we take what would be said during a round and translate it to what it actually means. So let's take the statement that would be given in a round, I value morality. What that actually means is I win if I demonstrate that voting for my side is consistent with morality, because the debater declared that morality is the most important consideration for whether we should affirm or negate. Next, we're going to be talking about value criteria. So, what is a value criterion? Although a lot of novices have trouble understanding what a value criterion is, it's actually pretty simple. It's just the standard test or metric for determining whether or not you have achieved or are most consistent with the value. And although a lot of people don't spend a lot of time on the value criterion debate, it's probably the most important part to weighing arguments. Now, you shouldn't spend all of your time in this debate, and you should definitely focus on the contention level debate. But at the same time, the value criterion is the direct link between the value and the contentions. It's what tells you whether or not you're achieving the value. And if you lose the value criterion, then your contentions don't really matter anymore. To understand a value criterion, let's do another translation activity. Let's say that the debater is already given a value of justice. And then what they say is the value criterion is protecting individual rights. What this means is that in order to determine if I'm more consistent with my value of justice, which is what they argued is the most important thing to win the round, I need to show that my side better protects individual rights. In other words, they're arguing that protecting individual rights is what it means to uphold justice. Understanding how a value criterion works lets us solve problems comparing impacts. Let's think about the issue we had earlier, in which the affirmative debater won the argument that, hey, having a living wage is going to increase standards of living. Meanwhile, we accept that the negative won the argument that it's going to hurt free trade. The winner of this debate is the one who wins the framework debate and wins the value and criterion. For example, if the negative debater wins that the value criterion should be protecting individual rights or something like that, then that means that that negative contention should be weighed a lot more than the affirmative one should, because the affirmative one isn't relevant to the winning framework. Now, obviously, winning the framework debate is going to be a lot easier said than done. So in terms of good strategies for how to go about doing that, you're going to need a good case, so look at my video on strategy and casing, and then you're also going to need to argue well in rebuttals, so look at the video on rebuttals. Lastly, I just want to talk about a few other important framework things that don't really fit in any other category all too well. One thing that a lot of debaters misunderstand is that winning the value criterion isn't actually a reason for the judge to vote for you. Rather, the value and criterion set up the rest of the voting issues. So just for an example of this principle in action, let's say that the affirmative debater won the value criterion that we should be looking to standards of well-being. But on the other hand, let's say that the negative effectively argued that something like a living wage is going to be hurting that through unemployment or something else. Winning the standard of evaluation is not the same thing as showing that you're consistent with that standard of evaluation. Next, make sure that every contention you read is relevant to your value criterion. Just going back to the purpose of a value criterion, it's the standard for whether or not the value is being satisfied. So if you're arguing for contentions that aren't really all that relevant to that value criterion, like a lot of novice debaters might do, it doesn't really fit into the rest of your case very well. And one way to make sure that you're not going to be ambiguous with how your contention is relevant to your value criterion, just be very explicit. For example, you could say something as straightforward as, this demonstrates why voting affirmative is consistent with the value criterion of promoting well-being because we're helping people in poverty. Now, while it can always be a bad thing to be too ambiguous with how you're relating to your criterion, it can never be bad to be too clear. Given that the debate community thrives off of the volunteer participation of parents or other judges who don't know a lot about LD at all, you always want to make sure that you're explaining your framework in a way that would make sense to somebody who has never heard of debate before. Now, the most important consideration for making this matter to the judge is explaining exactly how your framework functions. If you need to, you can use phrases that are very clear in how things function. For example, if you're responding to your opponent's value criterion, you might say something like, "This is a very poor standard of evaluation for justice for 3 reasons." Just use phrases like that that indicate the meaning of otherwise esoteric terms. So that's all we have for right now. This is Grant with Fight for Forensics. Thank you.